Hi, I'm Dr. Kelly Geddert from the Department of Psychology at Seton Hall University. In this video, I will be reporting on the results of a literature review that Dr. Vishwanathan and I did on concept mapping. We had an eye towards using concept mapping in online learning environments, but wanted to know if this was an effective tool for improving student learning. In this video, we will cover what concept maps are, why they might confer advantages over other learning strategies, and then we will take a look at the empirical evidence as to their effectiveness and when they work best. In addition to this video, our website provides 2 videos on getting started creating concept maps with the CMap Tools software. Concept maps are a form of graphical organizer, which are organizers of knowledge in graphical form, typically 2-dimensional. Both instructors and students are very familiar with graphical organizers and spontaneously use various kinds of them when teaching and studying. So for example, we are all familiar with using tables to organize information. This is a graphical organizer. As is the flowchart here on the right. This particular flowchart is a decision chart for doing text analysis in the digital humanities. Concept maps are a form of graphical organizer. They have a structure of nodes connected by links together which form propositions. In the context of concept mapping, a proposition is 2 concepts or ideas connected by a linking idea, also known as a link label. So for example, we have this proposition, seizures can be classified as focal, and we could represent that in a concept map shown here on the right, with seizures and focal, the 2 concepts in boxes, and can be classified as the link between the 2, forming a proposition. Now, some prescriptions for creating concept maps suggest that they should be hierarchical in nature, with the overarching or big concept at the top of the page, and with arrows indicating directional concept links. And so in this way, we can create kind of a more complex concept map structure. So for example, here I've just added that seizures can be classified as either generalized or focal. Here we see an even more complex concept map, and we could see how we could continue to add additional ideas and sub-ideas to the various parts of the structure. Now, concept mapping was originally developed and popularized by Joseph Novak at Cornell University in the 1970s. And he did so coming out of a constructivist learning theory approach. The idea was that students come into any learning environment with some background knowledge, and learning new knowledge requires assimilating that with their background knowledge. And that by creating concept maps that can make very explicit the connections that students have between various ideas, both old and new. Now, some people are familiar with mind maps, and so I want to differentiate concept maps from mind maps. Mind maps have less structure than do concept maps. They have a main idea in the center and then branches off of that, and then twigs off of each main branch. They lack the linking labels that we see in concept maps. You sometimes may see mind maps more frequently in business, while at least much of the empirical work in education has focused on the more structured concept maps, likely because of their ability to explicitly represent knowledge in propositions. There are 2 broad categories of ways in which concept maps are used in education. They've been used both as an assessment tool and as a learning tool. Because the majority of this video will deal with the use of concept maps as a learning tool, I'll just talk briefly about them as an assessment tool, and then we'll refocus ourselves on learning. So as an assessment tool, the concept maps have been used in 2 ways. One is that they're seen as an efficient assessment of student conceptual understanding, and this is because it's easier to produce an automated scoring of a concept map than it is something like an automated scoring of paragraphs and summarization in form of paragraphs. And it's for these reasons that there's been an uptick of concept mapping in things like medical education and nursing. It can also be used as formative assessment. So instructors in the classroom sometimes use it to discover what a student knows and where their knowledge gaps are, or to allow the student to discover those by interactively working with concept maps and perhaps checking it against a master concept map or an expert's concept map. In terms of using concept maps as a learning tools, they've been used in two ways. So sometimes an instructor might create a concept map to convey information. And the second way is for students to create the concept map where they're summarizing their own understanding or trying to retrieve from memory their own understanding of a conceptual topic. Now, there are a number of reasons why concept maps might confer learning benefits. And if we think just theoretically, and a number of different authors have pointed to these. One is something called the dual coding hypothesis. And according to the dual coding hypothesis, originally proposed by Paviot, we store verbal knowledge and mental imageries separately in the mind, but they're potentially interlinked memory codes. And so essentially, the dual coding hypothesis says that concept maps might confer benefits because you have both the verbal knowledge, these propositions and words, but then you're putting it onto a picture. And so it's kind of a redundant coding of the information. Concept maps might also help learners reduce their cognitive load. So essentially, by putting information out on a page in a form that is very easy to glance at and sort of understand, it can reduce the cognitive load of a student who's trying to construct their overall picture of an area. One hypothesis was that concept maps might also be better for people who have poor verbal learning ability. So this would be students who might have more difficulty creating paragraphs for summarizing information because they're struggling with aspects of grammar and so forth. And then what might appear to be at the surface level more obvious potential benefits of concept mapping is that it's active rather than passive. So particularly if you're using a student-created concept map. And essentially the concept map provides feedback in that either the instructor can create a sort of correct concept map and then explicitly give the student feedback, or the student can themselves, by trying to create the concept map and match it with a correct concept map, figure out whether they're on the right track. So I would refer to this as metacognition, so it can help improve the student's knowledge of what they know. Thankfully, recent technological advances have made concept mapping in the classroom much easier. So one concept mapping tool that is a freeware software that you can use either on the web or you can download it on your desktop is something called CMap tools. And CMap tools are actually what was used to draw the concept maps for this particular talk. Some things that are particularly nice about CMap tools that confer benefits for this software over some others is that one, it has an auto layout function. And so you can imagine that the layout of concept maps would have a big impact on their comprehensibility. If someone produces a very messy map, then they may not be able to go back to that map later and really understand it, or another person may not be able to go to it and easily understand it. So the auto layout function in CMap tools does the layout based on the hierarchical arrows, and in that way the student doesn't have to waste time trying to figure out the perfect layout. CMap tools also allows for linking across maps, and this can reduce the complexity of the map. So what this means is that if you have a concept that itself might be at one of the sub-levels of the concept of seizures, for example, but you could link to another map where that concept would be at the top of the hierarchy. So you can link across concepts. So here is an example. So say that we have seizures at the top, and one type of focal seizure could be a sensory seizure. then we could click on that and link to this other map that describes sensory seizures. Now, an additional tool that is, again, also free is something called C-Tools. The nice thing about C-Tools is that it has an automated scoring function, but a con about C-Tools is that it runs on a Java applet, which most browsers no longer support. This is a tool that was created by Doug Luckey through funding from the National Science Foundation, and they have made the source code available on their website, so it would be customizable if someone felt like taking that programming challenge. So we've discussed what concept mapping is and how it relates to other learning strategies that you might already be familiar with. But what is the evidence, right? What is the evidence that concept mapping actually works, and does it work better than other learning strategies? Now, we are going to present some evidence from a recent meta-analysis. And to give you some context, a meta-analysis is a quantitative review. So it takes a number of experiments or empirical studies, and it includes them if those studies meet certain quality criterion, and then it comes up with what's the average size of the effect across those included studies. So Schroeder et al. Published this meta-analysis on concept mapping, looking at student learning outcomes just this year. And let me first orient you to the statistics I'm going to show you here. So in the leftmost column is the comparison or control condition. So in all cases, there was one group where students were doing concept mapping, and in the other group was doing whatever in this left-hand column. So in this case, we have discussion or lecture was what the other group was doing. Hedges G effect size, this is a measure of the standardized difference between the group means. So for those who are familiar with statistical terms, this Hedges G of 1.05 means that the concept mapping group was one standard deviation above the discussion lecture group. To make that statistic kind of more concrete, we can translate that into the percent of people in the concept mapping group who scored above the control group's mean, and for a G of 1.05, that would be 86%. So with respect to concept mapping versus traditional discussion or lecture, this is a very large effect. And the students on average were scoring 86% greater than the 86% of the students were scoring greater than the mean of the group that got discussion and lecture. This last column is the number of studies. So in this case, this effect size is based on 37 studies, and totaling across the 37 studies, it was over 3,600 students or participants. Okay, so you have a sense of the statistics that I'm showing. So I'm just going to show you the rest of the table here because this meta-analysis included a number of studies and was able to compare concept mapping to various kinds of learning tools. One basis of comparison in 13 studies was studied or constructed lists. So studied means instructor provided, constructed means the students created them. They also compared it to studies or constructed outlines, studied text, so summaries of the information, or constructed text. So this would be the student creates a verbal summary, in paragraph form of the class information. And then there were some other studies that employed sort of various learning strategies. So one thing that you should note is that in all cases, concept mapping on average was better than these other learning techniques. So we can see that with the effect sizes here. And that we see these effect sizes are kind of medium to large depending on what the comparison group is. And so with more active activity like constructing text, The effect size isn't quite as large, but it's still a preferable learning strategy. So if concept mapping works, and we see that in this overall meta-analysis, now obviously in averaging across a bunch of studies, we're averaging out maybe some important pieces. And the Schroeder meta-analysis looked at kind of other potentially moderating factors. When does it work well? Are there certain situations where it works better, where it doesn't work? And so with that information and information from some other studies, Dr. Vishwanathan and I have sort of a recommendations for when concept mapping works best. And these really speak to implementation strategies. So how are you implementing concept mapping in the classroom? There's a strong recommendation from most people who do work on concept mapping to focus it on a particular question. Otherwise, you don't get a very well structured set of knowledge. The concept mapping also works best when it's student created rather than instructor created. And again, what I have here in parentheses is just the effect sizes. So there's a larger effect size for student created concept maps than instructor created. This might have to do with that active versus passive learning. It also works best or leads to the greatest improvements when it's part of instruction for 4 or more weeks. So that might suggest there's a little bit of a learning curve in terms of getting used to using concept maps as a learning strategy. There is some evidence that retrieval practice concept mapping may be better than concept mapping that is done with a text in front of a student. So let me unpack this a little bit. Retrieval practice means practicing retrieving stuff out of your head from memory. So that would be kind of like a closed book test on yourself. So, if you're using concept maps as a learning tool in your classroom, you might have students, be looking at their text while creating the concept maps. And essentially, that would be using it as summarization. Right? So they'd be kind of looking at the text and then summarizing the text in the form of a concept map. But there's at least one study demonstrating that actually having students create concept maps from memory leads to better improvement on exams than does just reviewing the material and creating a concept map from it. And this retrieval practice notion is a very strong, reliable effect in cognitive and educational psychology. That testing helps memory more than does just re-reviewing material. Now, there are some characteristics of implementation that do not affect learning outcomes. So both the meta-analysis and other articles have shown that there are similar benefits both for STEM and for non-STEM fields. So it works in the sciences and non-sciences. It's been demonstrated effective regardless of the learning level, so from grade school through college education. So the last thing that I want to do before concluding this presentation is give you a little preview of what you might expect to see were you to start using concept mapping in your classroom. Now, one is that research has suggested that the structure of maps produced by students may represent different levels of knowledge attainment. And so one group of authors described the structure as either a spoke, a chain, or a net. And so I have an example of those here on the right-hand side. So A here is a spoke where there is the central concept and everything else is linked directly to the central concept. B here is a chain. So there's the central concept at the top, and then each concept links out from the preceding concept. And then finally, C at the bottom is a net. So we have a central concept. Other concepts link out from that, so multiple concepts link out from that. But each of them has their own kind of sub-concepts. And so it's hypothesized that these 3 different structures, right, a spoke, a chain, and a net, represent increasingly complex knowledge or an increasingly complex understanding and complete understanding of the overall concept. So this table I have here is from Kinchin et al. And they point out that when you have a spoke structure, then you essentially have only one level because everything is connected to the main concept. So it doesn't really represent any of the interactions or associations between the different pieces, that there's very little integration. The chain begins, it has multiple levels, but they're all subordinate to each other, and this may not be appropriate because, for example, this particular chain is describing female parts as subordinate to male parts, and that's not an appropriate representation. And so the net is the most complex and sort of the most flexible with respect to adding new knowledge and accurately representing associations among concepts. So a number of studies have looked at differences either between the concept maps of experts and novices or between the concept maps of students before and after instruction. And so we're looking at one such study here, and we can see on the left a concept map drawn by an expert, and on the right a concept map drawn by a novice. And so what you should notice is that the expert has more concepts represented, more links among the concepts, and these links are fairly complex. So you'll notice that while this is a hierarchical structure, and the concept of cell is really at the top of it, that concept of cell is drawn towards the bottom here, and this concept map distinguishes between plant cells and animal cells, but it also describes those things that are common to both plant cells and animal cells, so across the two. So this is a fairly complex structure. And again, the one on the right looks less complex. We see a similar situation from this study of pre versus post instruction maps by West et al. And this is going back to the seizure example I used earlier. So our pre-instruction map of seizures is less complex, has less concepts represented in it, and has fewer links. But post-instruction, all that complexity is increased. So even though there's good evidence that using concept maps improves student learning, there are still a number of remaining questions. So there may be effects of how concept mapping is taught to students, right? What an instructor focuses on, how much instructional support there is. Obviously, if students are learning a new software program, there could be some level of frustration if they don't have adequate support for acquiring the knowledge to use it. A second remaining question is that actually much of the research on concept mapping has been conducted in traditional classroom environments. And this has occurred even though a number of authors have suggested that it is ideal for an online learning environment and for improving performance in an online learning environment. So I think still more needs to be done with respect to the use of concept mapping in the online learning environment. There might also be some possible drawbacks to the use of concept mapping. So one study published in 2015 found that when students were creating concept maps, that while it improved their knowledge of the overall structure of an area, that it disrupted their memory for some item-specific characteristics. And so, that might be another way to think about this is disrupting their memory for the details, like the nitty-gritty details, but improving their memory for the bigger picture. That was one study in one particular content area, so I think more work probably needs to be done following up on that study to see if this disruption of item-specific information generalizes across different kinds of content. But in conclusion, I think we can say that when students create their own concept maps using retrieval from memory, that these concept maps are superior to standard lecture and discussion for improving performance, and that they're potentially superior to a variety of instructional strategies, as we saw in the meta-analysis, and that they're also easier to assess and compare with respect to other kinds of assessment you might do, like essay questions. So this can facilitate peer feedback or automated feedback or self-grading of concept maps. On the website, we have 2 more videos so that you can get started in concept mapping with CMAP tools. And these are narrated by Dr. Vishwanathan. So there's a basic video and an advanced. And the last thing I want to leave you with today is just a concept map representing concept maps by Novick and Canis in one of their publications. And so you can inspect this to help improve your knowledge of concept maps.